to OCA's Prop 16 event called Asian Pacific Americans in Affirmative Action, the case for Prop 16. Today we have with us a slate of amazing panelists. But before we go to that, I just wanted to introduce some of you who may not be familiar with our organization to who we are. So OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that's actually a national organization. We have a headquarters in Washington, D.C., but we also have chapters in 50 chapters all around the country. This particular event is brought to you by several of the OCA's chapters in California, including OCA East Bay, San Francisco, Sacramento, San Mateo, Silicon Valley, and Los Angeles. And we are all pleased to be bringing you this event because Prop 16 has brought to the fore the issue of affirmative action and race-conscious policies, in a way that hasn't been present in the public debate for many years. And today we're going to have a lively discussion about dispelling a lot of the myths and also telling a lot of the facts about Prop 16 and about affirmative action, with a particular emphasis on its impact with Asian Americans. But just to let you know, OCA, in addition to working on this kind of an issue and this kind of programming, we also are monitoring and working on issues related to immigration, education, racial equity and inclusion, civic engagement and census, workforce development and technology. We are mostly a volunteer-based organization. We do have some staff located in Washington, D.C., but we have most of our work is done by interns and by volunteers. So to find out more about OCA, I encourage you to go to ocanational.org, which is our website, and you can find out about local chapters near you that you can join and help our efforts, and also to engage with our members and our programming. But without further ado, I'd like to open up this program by introducing our moderator, who is a highly distinguished person, and we're very lucky to have her here today, and that is Kristina Wong, who some of you can see right now with the flags behind her. Just let me tell you a little bit about Kristina, so you can get a sense of who Kristina is. She's been described by the East Bay Express as brutal but hilarious, a woman who takes life's absurdities very seriously. And Mother Nature Network describes her as one of the 7 funniest eco-comedians in the world. And Salon.com has awarded Kristina with presenting some 10 of the best moments in political comedy. So she's been highlighted in the New York Times and by numerous organizations and media outlets. She is a performance artist, a comedian, and writer, and who has presented internationally across the US, the UK, Hong Kong, and even Africa. She's been a guest on late night shows, including Comedy Central, FX, and she's an actor on film and TV. Her commentaries have appeared on American Public Media Marketplace, PBS, Vice, Jezebel, Huffington Post, and CNN. Also Playgirl magazine, but I'll leave that to her to discuss perhaps. She's created viral web series entitled, with titles like How Not to Pick Up Asian Chicks, and has just launched the 2nd season of her award-winning Radical Cram School web series. Her one-woman shows have just been taking the nation by storm. They include the Wong Street Journal, which was put on a few years ago. Also a long-running show called Wong Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which looked at high rates of depression and suicide among Asian American women, is now a concert film. And her newest performance project is Kristina Wong for Public Office, where she talks about her insights gained from being elected representative for the Wilshire Center Koreatown Subdistrict 5 Neighborhood Council. She does just amazing new things, many amazing things. More recently, during the pandemic, she has started another viral project called Anti-Sewing Squad, which is a nationwide network of volunteers who are sewing masks for vulnerable communities. This experience in erecting basically a factory for producing masks is going to be the subject of her next performance, Kristina Wong, Sweatshop Overlord. So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to bring Kristina Wong to the floor, and thank you for attending our event.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. My name's Kristina Wong. I am, as George said, your distinguished moderator. Distinguished, So this is my first time moderating something about a proposition. And I was asked to do this because I bring sort of a curiosity about Prop 16. It's something I'm familiar with affirmative action. I actually went to high school in San Francisco in the 90s. So if anyone else went to San Francisco in the 90s, I did not get into Lowell High School, which is sort of where I, so I've kind of come a long way. So from then, in the 90s, the term affirmative action was sort of like this terrible boogeyman for other Chinese Americans who were trying to get into all the best schools, and the word on the street was it was what was keeping us from getting any kind of opportunity and making us work twice as hard as anybody else. And as I've emerged, like now I'm a performance artist. I didn't get into Berkeley, but I'm fine. I'm a performance artist. I tour a show from my house. That explains this backdrop right here. I do a show about how I was elected to neighborhood council. I have no experience in politics before last year, but I won with 72 votes, if you include the vote I cast for myself. So, you know, voting counts. Voting is important. Voting gets people like me elected, and also changes the way we legislate, get money distributed around our country, and figure out who our leaders are. So I really appreciate that you've all come out today to spend an hour and a half on your Saturday to make an informed decision and learn about Prop 16 with me. As I learn from our guests about what is the case for Prop 16, what is the benefit to Asian Americans? How do we describe this benefit to other folks who don't think there's a benefit to Prop 16? And just be informed as we move forward about this, because there's, as I understand, a lot of misconceptions about this, a lot of myths, and I'm here to learn with you. So cool. So I'm really excited because we have these amazing speakers. We have a Q&A button. So as you percolate on questions and stuff, it's not the chat window, but if you look at the bottom of your Zoom bar, it says Q&A. You can go ahead, throw questions in there. And after we get through our speakers, we'll begin to take questions from you all in the last 20 or 30 minutes. Sounds good? Yes, it's a webinar, so I get no feedback. I'm assuming yes, great. Cool, so let's talk to our first speaker. It was a presentation to give us a great backdrop about what is Prop 16 and what is affirmative action. Jonathan Locke is an organizer for Asian Students for Affirmative Action. He recently graduated from my alma mater, UCLA, where he studied political science and Asian American studies, and he plans on enrolling in a master's in the public policy program next fall. In previous roles, Jonathan served as a youth advisory council member for the College Board, a youth ambassador for the White House Initiative on AAPIs, a peer counselor for UCLA's Community Programs Office, and a legislative intern for Senator Feinstein's office. So this is going to be multimedia, so I'm super excited because I'm a very visual person. I'm going to welcome Jonathan Locke.
Hi, everybody. Well, thank you so much for OCA and George and everyone else for having me here. I'm super excited to be here and to share my thoughts and you know, the information about Prop 16, because I really know that once people know about it, they're going to turn out and vote yes on it. So give me a second while I share my screen and start. Oh, wrong button. All right. Does everyone see the full screen presentation? Great. All right. So Prop 16 really is about affirmative action, and Prop 16 helps public agencies reinstate affirmative action. But to get there, we have to understand what is affirmative action. And affirmative action is a tool for promoting equal opportunity for people who have historically faced these kinds of educational, economic, and institutional barriers to achieving success. And historically, these populations have included women, Blacks, Latinos, Indigenous, and Asian Americans. And overall, in countering discrimination, affirmative action policies attempt to give everyone a fair shot at success. Other things to know about affirmative action is that it has its roots in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Black activists in the 1960s pushed John F. Kennedy to pass the first civil rights legislations, including executive orders promoting affirmative action and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, among other legislation. Currently, 41 states permit affirmative action and only 9 states have a ban on affirmative action. Prop 16 is also legislation that repeals Proposition 209, which was passed in 1996, and that legislation banned affirmative action practices in public hiring, contracting, and education. It was passed at the height of Governor Pete Wilson's administration, and he's the same guy who passed Prop 187, which would have denied public services to undocumented immigrants. It was supported by Ronald Reagan and right-wing Wall Street interests, many of whom are opposing Prop 16 today. Furthermore, there was this huge outcry from students throughout the University of California system, including at UCLA, my alma mater. Students there turned out in thousands to protest Prop 209 and included blocking streets and even committing to arrest to bring this fight to the attention to the public. It's important to note that now in 2020, this is the farthest we've ever come to repealing Proposition 209. What would Prop 16 do? Well, Prop 16 allows public agencies to reinstate affirmative action programs. It allows California to take into account many factors, including race and gender, when making decisions with regard to government contracting, hiring, and education. And again, it puts California into alignment with the 41 other states, the federal government, and many private institutions that are already practicing affirmative action. And Prop 16 helps California achieve a diverse workforce reflective of the state's population. Prop 16 really is an equal opportunity initiative. It helps fight wage discrimination by ensuring women are fairly considered for advancements and promotions at work. It helps close the leadership and pay gaps for women. It also helps encourage investment opportunities in K-12 education by providing for STEM education for girls and targeted college and career counseling. Prop 16 also helps women and POC-owned businesses thrive because currently they lose approximately $1.1 billion a year in lost contracts. Furthermore, Prop 16 allows equity in higher education by expanding opportunities and resources to students to help them reach their full potential and to help grow our population of diverse professionals to help serve all of our communities. Prop 16 also really helps invest in women. Prop 16 allows California to be a state where women can earn higher wages, get promoted more, and start lucrative careers at a higher rate. And Prop 16 would help fight gender discrimination and promote equal opportunity for all California women. As I said earlier, Prop 16 will help close the wage gap. Currently, women earn 80 cents on the dollar compared to men, and Latinas earn just 41 cents. Currently, there are also 1.5 million women-owned businesses in the state, but they grow at a slower rate and earn less revenue compared to male-owned firms. And Prop 16 will help turn the tide by increasing investment opportunities in women-owned businesses. Also, Prop 16 helps improve access for women in well-paying jobs and promotions. Currently, women only sit on just 15% of corporate boards and are only 33% of UC tenured faculty. And Prop 16 will help improve women's access for promotions in these areas and help them lead their companies and organizations into the future. Prop 16 also talks about K-12 education, and it'll allow schools to target resources to meet the needs of their specific students, again, by providing programs like STEM programs for girls and targeted career training for high school students of color. It will also invest in new educator outreach programs so that schools can hire more teachers who look like them and so that they can represent the overall diversity of their classrooms. Prop 16 will also really allow the state to diversify its teaching workforce. Again, when we look at the statistics, 77% of California's K-12 student population are students of color, but only 35% of our teaching workforce in K-12 are teachers of color, and that's gotta change. And this is also something that's very talked about, higher education. Prop 16 will allow our higher education institutions to better allocate dollars to support and meet the needs of college students who really need it the most. And it'll also help close graduation gaps and improve academic success of all students attending public higher education systems. It'll improve access to our excellent public colleges and universities regardless of where students look like or where they come from. And it will also help invest in universities' targeted outreach programs to recruit more diverse applicants. But it's really important to note that Prop 16 is not going to be reinstating any quotas. And Prop 16 will help with the enrollment of students of color at California's most selective and resource institutions, because California has not kept pace with the demographic composition of our high school seniors. In public contracting, California is a powerhouse. We spend billions upon billions of dollars in public contracting, but that spending is not equitable. Women and POC-owned businesses lose, again, $1.1 billion a year, and contracts awarded to those firms dropped by approximately 80% when Prop 209 passed. Prop 16 will change this by, again, repealing Prop 209 and allowing agencies to conduct key disparity studies and restore government's abilities to make targeted investments that empower these women and POC-owned firms. And finally, in the area of employment and hiring, California can, again, have a workforce that mirrors the state's diversity. White men are currently overrepresented in our state's leadership, and it keeps women and people of color out by preventing them from climbing the ladder. Also in our local governments, in Los Angeles, for example, male employees outnumber female employees by 2 to 1, and female employees in the city only are paid 76% compared to men. Prop 16 will change this by allowing women equal access to raises and promotion, and allowing the state and cities to use targeted outreach programs to engage more job applicants who are women and people of color. A really important question is why now? And so several polls have been conducted over the past few years, and last year there was a poll that showed that there was a path to victory in California in 2020. After the campaign launched in March, the impacts of COVID-19 and protests surrounding George Floyd's, Ahmaud Arbery's, and Breonna Taylor's murders underscored how urgently we really need to build a more equitable California. And furthermore, this 2020 electorate will be vastly larger, more diverse, and more eager to vote for change than the one that voted in 1996. Our core message is that Prop 16 really expands opportunity for all. It increases access to fair wages and good jobs, and quality schools for everybody. Prop 16 fights wage discrimination and systemic barriers by opening up opportunities for women and people of color. And by passing Prop 16, we can really live up to our California values and build a stronger California where everyone has the resources that they need to thrive. But that said, again, we also have to talk about these myths and misconceptions within the AAPI community. But really, affirmative action is a solution that helps everybody, including AAPIs. Studies have shown that universities that practice affirmative action see greater gains in Asian American enrollment, and these universities aren't just limited to the University of Texas, the University of Virginia, and the University of North Carolina. Asian American owned businesses also lose money on public contracts just as like other minority owned businesses. And just like every other Californian, Asian Americans want more teachers who look like them, more principals, more university presidents, more first responders, and more. But current law really prevents that. And racial quotas, again, were deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1978, and they will never be put back into place. Our opposition is a small coalition of Republican donors and Trump sympathizers. Ward Connerly and Gail Harriet are longtime opponents of affirmative action who have proudly donated and support Trump. They use fear-mongering, misinformation, and racial division as their main tactics. And our campaign's goal is to increase education around affirmative action to really stop the spread of this misinformation that these groups are disseminating. So how can you support a Prop 16 and help create a California that values diversity? You can visit our website. It has a lot of resources and a lot of fact pages. Does it hold our list of endorsements, of which there are thousands of names on that. And you can also volunteer. We have almost daily phone banks and text banks. You can donate to our campaign, and you can follow us on our various social media channels. So thank you so much for supporting equal opportunity, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. As you watch these presentations and have questions, again, if you're just joining us, you can throw a question in the Q&A. You did get one question I'd love to ask you now, which is are you able to share this presentation publicly, Jonathan, or is there somewhere else that we can direct folks for the same information?
Mm-hmm. So all of this information is on our website. We have fact sheets there, and those are really helpful. I highly encourage everyone who has any questions to go to that page.
So what I really thought was something I didn't even think about with this, because for me, I obsessively think of this as like a race thing, but that it does have such an impact on women-owned businesses. And can you explain maybe technically how that works, that with affirmative action, women were getting more opportunities, but now without it, they have lost contracts. So can you explain the sort of technicals of how that works, that women businesses, yeah.
So I believe in the public contracting process, there are these mild considerations of race that allow the spending to be distributed more equitably. So even in small governments, there are certain provisions that allow for the contracts to be prioritized for firms that have, employees who live closer to the projects, so that the money that is spent on these public projects gets to be able to circulate throughout the local economies. And so that's similarly what's the intent of Prop 16, so that the funds that are spent with the public contracts get more equally and equitably distributed. And
I think one or sort of stereotype or maybe myth of affirmative action is that underqualified minorities are getting hired over qualified majorities or white groups. So can you clarify that and what that that process?
So at no point will someone be underqualified and still be awarded a contract or a job. Everyone still has to be meeting these certain qualifications, and it doesn't serve the public interest to have underqualified folks obtain these contracts and jobs. Folks still have to be well skilled, and again, race and gender is only allowed to be a small factor in this comprehensive process that includes overall costs and other things like that.
And Oiyan rightfully pointed out to me that it's not just women-owned businesses, but it's minority and women-owned business programs that have something to gain from affirmative action. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I'm going to pass it to our next presenter, who I've had the privilege of knowing for 20 years and seeing her grow as a scholar and academic, and now a program officer. Dr. Oiyan Poon is a program officer at the Spencer Foundation and a faculty affiliate in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and in the Higher Education Leadership Program at Colorado State University. Her research focuses on the racial politics of college access, affirmative action, and Asian Americans. Her studies on affirmative action include projects on Asian American business owners and public contracting, and why Asian Americans choose to support or oppose affirmative action in higher education. Currently, she is completing a study on how race-conscious admissions works at highly selective colleges and universities. She was an admission reader at UC Davis and a scholarship reader for the Gates Millennium Scholarship Program for AAPIs. She is also a co-lead author of amicus briefs on behalf of 678 social scientists in support of diversity in SFFA versus Harvard. Oiyan received her PhD in education, race and ethnic studies, and a graduate certificate in Asian American studies at UCLA. Please welcome Dr. Oiyan Poon.
I had to find the unmute button. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. Really excited to be here today. So I started my research career about the time I think I first met Kristina, about 20 years ago, as someone who was uncertain and not sure about what the implications of affirmative action are for especially Asian Americans. So I followed that motivation for inquiry and study. You know, when you're curious about something, I guess I start going down rabbit holes, right? That's what researchers do. Today, I'm going to share about some of the things I've learned through my research career. And if there's one thing you can take away from my presentation today, it's that, as Jonathan mentioned, race and gender cannot be the reason for anyone's selection or rejection in any kind of opportunity, particularly in employment, contracting, and in education. And that Asian Americans benefit when systems of opportunity distribution recognize how racism affects our individual circumstances. And it's really hard not to recognize in this very moment of the COVID pandemic, in the ways that Trump continues to use words like the Kung flu or China virus. We know through the Stop AAPI Hate Center at SF State, they're documenting a huge spike in anti-Asian racism and violence and harassment. So in this moment, when racism is so present in our lives directly and so clearly, we really need to consider and understand how exactly does affirmative action work. And so a question for all of you out in the audience, including the panelists, do you actually have a fact-based understanding of affirmative action? So right now, out there in Zoom land, if you can just jot down on a piece of paper or just keep in mind your answer to this, do you have a fact-based understanding of affirmative action? And we'll return to this question at the end to see whether your answer would change. So as Jonathan mentioned, affirmative action arose out of the civil rights movement. And so right after Brown v. Board of Education, which outlawed segregation in public schools, and due to the civil rights movement, President Kennedy signed Executive Order 10925 and created the Equal Opportunity Commission. And this is when affirmative action first appeared in government documents. In this executive order, he said, we need to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. It's a more passive framing of non-discrimination than an anti-discrimination framework, which occurred later when President Johnson signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and that whole panel of civil rights legislation, including the Immigration and Naturalization Act that opened up immigration to immigrants from Asia. And in 1965, I think the sentiment of the shift in affirmative action of being anti-discrimination really came to the fore in a commencement speech that LBJ delivered at Howard University, where he said, "You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bring him up to the starting line of a race and say, you are free to compete with all others and still justly believe that you've been completely fair. Thus, it's not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates." More assertive policy framing is what's present in this speech and this shift in the underlying spirit of affirmative action. And you know, the Voting Rights Act was around the same time, the Fair Housing Act, the Civil Rights Act, so on and so forth. So it's really important to remember that affirmative action really started with public employment and public contracting, and that post-secondary institutions increasingly practiced affirmative action in response to recognizing their histories of blatantly excluding people of color from opportunities in higher education. And so, unfortunately, almost immediately after affirmative action policies began, there was a white backlash claiming reverse discrimination. And in recent years, Asian Americans, and especially a lot of mostly Chinese immigrants, have taken up this campaign against anti-racist policies to push for a rollback of passive non-discrimination policies. So they're pushing for just much more passivity, and even in the face of blatant racism, they don't want proactive analysis of racial inequalities and for strategic policy initiatives to address these problems. Some of these opponents of affirmative action have appropriated a few of Martin Luther King's words in their campaigns against anti-racist policies, in particularly the "I Have a Dream" speech. But as his daughter, Bernice King, Dr. Bernice King, mentioned in a tweet very recently, she's not happy with this misappropriation of her father's words. And I had to chuckle when in her tweet, it kind of felt like she was saying, like, if you really think my father was against affirmative action, you need to study a little bit harder. So I appreciate Dr. King's words here in Twitter. So I know Jonathan mentioned about employment and contracting. I won't mention too much about employment stats, but I just want to highlight my colleague, sociologist Margaret Chin's new book, Stuck. And in her research, she's found that Asian Americans with comparable and higher levels of education remain stuck in being promoted in their places of work. And Jonathan also mentioned teacher statistics. So in California, the latest stats that I found was that 12% of California's K-12 students are Asian American and Pacific Islander, but the teacher workforce lags quite a bit. And as an educational researcher, I have to point out that when you have teachers and educators that look like you, who understand your experiences, students' educational attainment levels actually rise and their performance actually improves. And in public contracting, Paul Ong and I, Professor Paul Ong at UCLA and I conducted a study about 10 years ago on the effects of Proposition 209, the affirmative action ban, on Asian American business enterprises, AABEs, and public contracting. So the San Francisco area, Bay Area, is a very, is home to a lot of Asian Americans. I think we can all agree to that. However, the number of contracts that went to Asian American owned businesses after Proposition 209 dropped to just under 7%. It was about 6 to 7% of contracts in the San Francisco region that were awarded to Asian American owned businesses. Now, one might say, maybe there's not a whole lot of Asian American owned businesses. I would not say that. And in fact, what was fascinating was we compared the San Francisco region to Chicagoland, which is where I am in right now, and the Atlanta metro region, where both of these metro areas practice minority and women-owned business programs that promote and help government agencies and prime contractors know what small businesses are out there. Without these programs, the San Francisco region of Asian American businesses fared worse than the Asian American businesses in Chicago and Atlanta. So quickly, I know everyone's super worked up when it comes to college admissions, and that's quite frankly most of my current research focuses on a very quick history lesson on the Supreme Court and race-conscious admissions. Is that, as Jonathan mentioned, in 1978 in the UC Regents versus Bakke case, the Supreme Court ruled that quotas were unconstitutional. So when the opposition today to Prop 16 keeps saying, well, it's a quota, it's going to limit Asian American numbers, or it's because the population of Asian Americans is X percent in the state, that means the UC is going to become X percentage of Asian Americans. That's a quota and it's illegal. And so anyone else saying that that's what Prop 16 is bringing is quite frankly, they're lying. Also in this case, the Supreme Court said, you know, hey, colleges and universities, they're educational institutions. It's really important then to make sure that these colleges and universities are empowered to deliver the best possible educational environments and circumstances possible. And decades of research science has demonstrated that diversity is absolutely essential to the best possible educational experiences. There's cognitive development advances, civic engagement improvements. There's a whole boatload of educational benefits from diversity, essentially. And the court in 1978 recognized that and said, because of this, race can be one of many factors. And in 2003, in the two Michigan cases, the Grutter versus Bollinger and Gratz versus Bollinger cases, the Supreme Court again said, yes, diversity still is very important. And so much so that it is a compelling interest, it remains a compelling interest to use race as one factor among many. In the Gratz case, the Supreme Court also said that you cannot provide automatic point bonuses. So there's a myth out there that affirmative action is practiced as if you check off a certain underrepresented minority box in the demographic section, that you get extra points. That has not been true since before 2003. So that's been quite some time now. And finally, most recently in 2016, in Fisher versus UT Austin, maybe some of you remember this as Abby with the bad grades. And that case, the Supreme Court again said, yes, diversity remains important. Now we have even more decades of science to show us that diversity is absolutely important for educational purposes and benefits. And in this, Justice Kennedy actually mentioned, you know, you have to do things holistically. You have to review students holistically. So what exactly is holistic or comprehensive review? The UC calls it comprehensive review. But because of Prop 209, comprehensive review in the California system is not race conscious. So what exactly is race conscious holistic review? And as Kristina mentioned, I'm currently in the midst of finishing up a research study where I am analyzing data from, I conducted interviews with 51 college admissions officers last year to ask them, how does race-conscious holistic review work? And we went through it with some of these people and really got some great information. And so this visual here really, I think, represents how it works. You have the individual applicant, and I think we can all agree that individuals are influenced by and shaped by their families, their schools, their communities, and society, and that shapes the opportunities that people have. And so that's really highlighted in Sally Chen's sign here. Sally Chen was one of the Harvard students that testified in the Harvard case in defense of diversity. She said, "I support affirmative action because there are complex stories in Asian America that need to be told, and they can't be separated from the impacts of racism in this country." And so, again, especially in this moment, we know that racism and patriarchy are real, and that they have very specific impacts on Asian American communities, and that without affirmative action, these full stories can't be told. Now, I'm going to end here by saying, you know, yes, our stories are very important, but as Jonathan already pointed out, race and gender can never be the reason for selection in employment, contracting, or admissions. It helps in the evaluation process to understand a business or a college applicant or an employment applicant and their whole story and what they might bring to a particular opportunity or setting or campus or employer, but it can never be the reason. At this, you know, Sally could tell all the stories she wanted about her life growing up as a Chinese American girl in San Francisco, but if she did not have a stellar academic record at the same time, she would not have gotten into Harvard, right? And had Harvard not been able to account for her whole story that she was telling in her application, her not perfect test scores and not perfect grades maybe would have weighed more heavily. So again, this is my main takeaway for you all, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Poon. It was so cool to see you do presentation. I know you've interviewed so many admissions officers. I want to note that cartoon that you have, which shows the balding white guy in a race against the Black woman, and she has like literally crocodiles and swords in a swamp, and then he just has the things to jump over. Now, a lot of opponents will say, but Asian Americans also had maybe not as much swamp as Black folks, but we still raced across. So how do we respond to that?
Yeah, yes, and that is
the third lane that we don't see in that cartoon.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if we maybe expanded out the frame of that picture in the cartoon, we would see Asian Americans and we know that Asian Americans are extremely diverse, right? All kinds of different manners of obstacles and barriers and dangers, right? And that's exactly why we need Prop 16 and affirmative action, because without it, all of these things get thrown away and they're like, well, gee, you had a 4.2 instead of that 4.3 that the kid next to you got who was white. You know, like those are not a difference whatsoever, to be honest. And so it's important to then understand the whole context and really think through what is it that these applicants bring. And so that story of these crocodiles and the barbed wire and the swamp and so on and so forth, that we face in our own way in very different ways across the Asian American community. And, you know, the Black community also faces very diverse, you know, those crocodiles and swamps and barbed wire also look different for different people. And so I think it's really important to highlight that it's individualized review. So again, this is why kind of the bonus points got knocked out and quotas got knocked out in the Supreme Court, is because it wasn't individualized. It wasn't looking at us as individuals. Kristina, you and I are both Chinese American. We grew up in very different circumstances, me on the East Coast, you on the West Coast. We are very different people, right?
No, we're not. We're the same. We are the same. You're also doing a show in your house.
That's true. Oh my gosh, but I have this fake background. But we're very different people, and so we should be understood. Our stories should be understood as unique individual stories, and that's what affirmative action does.
And that's just to emphasize, so I am also clear, this, if Prop 16 passes, it still will be individualized assessment of who moves forward. There are no points, nothing like that. It's looking at the whole person or applicant or company and what they bring to the table.
Review. Mm-hmm.
Great, awesome. And then we just FYI, we can figure out the answer to this in our Q&A, but Catherine Fong is super interested, and Yvette Sang is also asking about your research and how we can find this presentation. I think Catherine was really super interested in replicating Jonathan's presentation, but can't find it on the web. So we can figure out how to answer that at the Q&A. You figure out how you want to disseminate that information if you want to. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is my brother from possibly another mother. Bill Wong. Wong is a consultant that specializes in helping clients overcome complex policy and political challenges with precisely executed aggressive, creative, and asymmetric tactics and strategies. His firm has advised large employers, labor organizations, political action committees, and candidates for local, state, and federal office. His firm provides services that include grassroots organizing, independent expenditure campaigns, fundraising, PAC direction, ethnic voter targeting, and messaging. Among other clients, Bill serves as a senior political advisor to California State Assembly Speaker Anthony Rendon and political director for the California Assembly Democrats. Bill has nearly 3 decades of legislative experience that includes serving as Chief of Staff to the State Assembly member Anthony Rendon, Chief of Staff to State Assembly member Judy Chu, Chief of Staff to State Senator Hilda L. Solis, and Legislative Director to State Assembly member Mike Honda. During his tenure in legislature, so I guess you were elected, Bill, like me. Bill successfully developed and guided to the passage of millions of dollars in the state budget funding for essential health and human services programs and groundbreaking legislation on Asian and Pacific Islander issues, wildfire conservation, revenue and taxation policy, and hate crimes enforcement. Mr. Wong also worked over 3 years as a registered contract lobbyist, where he represented community-based consumer organizations and labor interests on legislation relating to taxation, health, child support, domestic violence, public utilities, rent control, and toxics. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree in political science and a minor degree in Asian American Studies at the University of California, Davis. He also served as a guest lecturer for UC Davis and has been a guest on public radio and Current TV's War Room with Jennifer Granholm as a Democratic strategist and expert on AAPI votes. Please welcome the very smart, very knowledgeable brother from another mother, Bill Wong.
Thanks, Kristina. I have to say I'm much less accomplished than Oiyan and Jonathan. So I only have a bachelor's degree, so I'm like the bad Asian in this scenario.
Me too. I dropped out of grad school.
Yeah.
Grad school dropout. And you were elected, is this right?
No, I was not elected, but I served as staff for quite a long time.
Oh, you served as staff.
Yeah. And
hey,
you know, I think that's
big.
Yeah.
I was elected, just FYI. I'm going to let you go. I'm going to stop interrupting you.
Well, being elected, I think, has its benefits and its drawbacks. So I applaud you for running for office because not enough Asians run for office. In fact, when I first started in politics, there were no Asians serving in the state legislature, and we've come a long way. And we've come a long way, not necessarily because of merit. I mean, I think that my role in this panel is to talk about the politics and how politics makes things fair or unfair in our world and how we have to kind of look at it. I think the most important thing with regard to Prop 16 and affirmative action right now is to address it from the perspective of perception. And I think that one of the things that bothers me the most is this ongoing stereotype that Asians are a certain way and have a certain belief about affirmative action, and that the vast majority of Asian Americans oppose affirmative action, when in fact that is not true. And you're going to see a lot of this stuff in the campaign. We are now in an environment of campaigning where disinformation is a standardized political practice. There's going to be a lot of stuff that you see on Twitter and Facebook and WeChat that is misrepresentation of the facts. What Jonathan and Dr. Poon have provided are great resources with regard to that, but fighting that on platforms that are in 140 characters or less is extremely difficult. What's really helpful is for people to have real conversations with their families and friends about it, conversations that are not toxic and that not highly rhetorically based. So I'll give you a couple of stats. I don't want to use them all, and I don't have fancy charts like Jonathan or Dr. Poon did, but these stats are important because it does dispel the perception of where Asian Americans stand on affirmative action. From AAPI data, they recently did a poll, and it showed that 35% of AAPIs support affirmative action, 21% oppose, and 43% either didn't know or were undecided. So it's not this vast 70–80% majority that you seem to, many people seem to feel when they go onto WeChat or when they look at social media or talk to certain relatives or family members about it. These are kind of statistical data points from polling, and I was involved in a very deep dive of polling for Asian American voters, specifically voters in California, with regard to Prop 16. And it's interesting to note the general data points in this. When we first posed the question without any information whatsoever about whether or not people should support Proposition 16, and these were just Asian voters, we did it in language and we did deep dive onto it with a lot of questions, but with just the ballot title, 38% supported, 37% opposed, and 16 were undecided, and 9% said they wouldn't vote. Now, when we did the arguments, and this is a standard practice among political campaigns, is to do the hardest arguments, against the proposition, and then the strongest arguments for the propositions. So after the strongest positive and negatives, the resulting data showed that 41% then supported affirmative action, and 34% opposed, 19% were undecided, and 6% would not vote. So you saw growth with regard to after you hit the most even unfair and untrue aspects of allegations against Prop 16, the growth of the yes side increased. But I'm in politics, so facts don't really matter. So you can have those statistics and really kind of juggle them about. I just wanted that as context so that when people think that there's all these Asians who are opposing affirmative action, I'll just say that the data that I've seen does not back that up. If anything, there's just a lot of people who just don't know. A lot of people don't feel like they're effective, but are affected by it. And then there are significant portions that are for and against. So, but not a majority on either side. So there's a lot of room to grow there. I think the second point I really want to make is that for the purposes of just politics, it's the simplicity of it. When Prop 209 was proposed, and I was around when Prop 209 was proposed, it promised that it would end discrimination. Now, a quarter century later, I don't know where anybody who's on this Zoom webinar is, but if anybody can honestly say that discrimination has ended or does not exist because 25 years of 209, then feel free to vote no on Prop 16. So when a law like Prop 209 has fundamentally failed to deliver the colorblind society that it promised 25 years ago, the only action that the voters have is to repeal it because it failed. And it failed miserably because we are not there. And whether you are black, brown, white, woman, or whatever, it is clear that from the hiring data, the contracting data, the admissions data, that 209 failed to establish the colorblind fair society that it had promised during the campaign. And the reason why, and I'll add this as part of the political aspect of why we do things in politics. And this was a quote from a Republican consultant about why Prop 209 was proposed 24 years ago. And he said, and it was quoted in the Los Angeles Times, it was the wedge issue of immigration and affirmative action as the supposed engines of a Bob Dole upset in California. So it was a political tool. It was not a policy decision. It was not to make things fair. They were using it to consolidate a certain segment of the voter population. And since its intent was not fairness, it's understandable that it did not deliver the type of fairness that it claimed to be. And obviously, everybody's been through a lot of elections, and they know that politicians promise quite a bit and never deliver on it. And I think that that's what 209 was 24 years ago. And that's why I feel strongly that it needs to be repealed this year. So aside from that, and aside from the stats I gave you, I want to leave you with, kind of my final argument of how I perceive this, and how I think is the easiest way to perceive this in this era of misinformation. And that starts from the foundation that laws are informed by facts, but guided by morals. So I think everybody who's conflicted about this issue, it comes down to a moral obligation that supersedes individual self-interest. The bottom line question that everyone watching this panel has to ask themselves is, if I haven't been robbed, but I see my neighbor being robbed over and over again, do I have an obligation to do something about it? Is that my role in society? And for me, particularly for me, I feel that as a Chinese American, a proud Chinese American, I think there's a long tradition of, fighting against tyranny, fighting against injustice. I mean, that's why I have my Zoom background, is because my hero represents righteousness in the Chinese American culture. And I feel that as a Chinese American, and perhaps even though I did have some challenges growing up and have faced discrimination, I feel that I have more opportunities than other people. But just because I have more opportunities than other people doesn't mean that I can deny or be a part of any effort to deny somebody else those same opportunities. And I want to bring a very tangible experience I had when I was first started in politics. And it was in the mid-1980s. And one of the things that the UC was going to do was change the weighting of the SATs. So when we talk about merit and how everything should be based on merit, this really addresses that. One of the things that they wanted to do was they wanted to weight the English language aspect of the SAT more than the math aspect of the SAT. And that was a subtle way to reduce Asian admissions, because obviously there are a lot of Asian immigrants that were great at math, but sucked at English. And that changing the balance of that merit-based would have reduced Asian American admissions to the UC at the time. Now, at that same time, there were no Asian Americans serving in the state legislature. So the Asian Americans had no voice whatsoever in the halls of power at the UC Regents with regard to the ability to change this. However, it was the legislators, the progressive legislators, Black, Latino, and white, that got together and forced the UC to not adopt that policy. So we can never look at this perspective from the lens of saying, what helps me today and what can I do based upon my majority representation on wherever I'm at. This is an environment where we have to be allies with everybody else in the pursuit of justice and understanding the bigger picture. So if, and those individuals that the white legislators, they had constituents that may have lost out as a result of not adopting that policies, but everybody has to give up a little bit of something that they're interested in order to ensure that there is fairness across the board, or at least the opportunity for fairness across the board in our democracy. Now you can talk about any other place on earth, but this is America, and this particularly is California, and we're here for a reason, and we're here because we believe a certain level of equity and opportunity and the American dream that is uniquely exemplified by the greatness of our state. But if you look at the 24 years since 2009, you will still see a tremendous amount of discrimination. And that's my ending argument of why I think that Asian Americans particularly should support Prop 16.
Thank you so much, Bill. I think the clearest, and I'll reiterate for folks who respond better to my shrill voice moderating, but but what you say is that the reason why 209 was pushed was this myth of this colorblind society, that if we take away this sort of prioritizing people of color, just make people do it on their merit, everyone will be equal. But we haven't gotten those results from doing that. In fact, from the previous presentations, we've seen that it's actually created a situation where women and minority-owned businesses are getting fewer contracts, and So do you want to just emphasize that for us? That
I mean, I think that the probably the best distillation, I think I said on kind of our planning call, is that trying to end discrimination by refusing to consider race is like trying to stop the spread of COVID by reducing access to tests and suppressing data on infection rates. That's what it comes down to. If you're not considering race in some form or manner, you're never going to know whether or not discrimination is occurring.
Yeah, I see that. Like a lot of these theories about how everything would be fair if we didn't take away these things only make sense if it was already fair to begin with, which it clearly is not. I mean, this pandemic has really shown the racial disparities in health, the economic disparities in health, right? And I've seen, as someone who was sewing masks, that yeah, I could sew masks for everyone, or what I'm finding our group doing is sewing masks specifically for communities that are affected. And it wouldn't make sense to sew a mask for someone just who has a job watching Netflix at home, right? Like and the same with the affirmative action. It's just trying to figure out who isn't getting these opportunities to succeed, and moving them forward and ahead so that they can succeed. Great, thank you. And I also want to touch on something that came up in our planning call, because when I was researching this, there was a lot, like I was like, are these bots? I can't tell. the resistance on Prop 16 is it's ever present, and it almost feels like unreal. And I've been kind of clicking through to try to figure out if people are real even. And do you want to talk about a little bit more about this disinformation and
yeah, I mean, that's
campaign that you understand it?
Yeah, that's the disturbing thing about politics now is in the past there used to be just a spirited debate between different sides that just had a disagreement or had different data or whatever. But ever since the 2018 election, where different interests, whether the corporate or international, have an interest in sowing dissent in the United States for kind of geopolitical reasons. And this is all well documented, in a lot of places. So, the stuff that you see on WeChat and Twitter and on Facebook, a lot of it is what we call, computerized, kind of influence. They are trolls that are bots that are kind of generated at troll farms. So it's all manufactured. And I think that, people are trying to get their information from Twitter or Facebook. They're going to be at a disservice of what is true or not. And that's where a lot of the disinformation is being spread. And it's also a very toxic environment where instead of being able to talk between two different people that have like a different understanding about an issue, it is much more hostile. It is much more adversarial. And that's not because there are different people that believe different things. It's because there are entities out there that are trying to sow that type of racial division that's out there for greater political purposes that have nothing to do with the Asian American community or fairness or the issue of Prop 16.
Yeah, and then just to clarify for everyone watching, I am not a bot. None of us here are bots. We're real. Ow, ow. And even though Oiyan and Jonathan have fake bookcases behind them to signal literariness, they are not bots. So great, wonderful. So I'm gonna bring our final amazing speaker, who is Jenny Lam. Jenny Lam is a member of the San Francisco Board of Education and serves as education advisor to San Francisco Mayor London Breed. After being appointed to the Board of Education, Jenny was elected in November 2019 to continue serving as commissioner. She brings a student-first approach in her work that is informed by her being a public school parent. For over 20 years, Jenny has dedicated her professional life to public service and served in a number of executive leadership positions with nonprofit organizations, including Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco, where she led education initiatives and worked to expand civil and political rights for immigrant youth and families. Born and raised in San Francisco Bay Area, daughter of Chinese immigrants, she's a first-generation college student, earned her bachelor's degree and double major in political science and Asian American studies from University of California, Santa Barbara. Hi, Jenny.
Hi there.
Hey, Jenny. Hello. So we're going to chat a little. There's a lot of questions coming up about what do we tell to conservative parents who are worried about what this means for their kids. And I know this, I came from that family, from that household, and there was no convincing, and there probably still is no convincing a lot of the aunties in my family that their kids in the San Francisco school district system or in general benefit from this. So what are some responses you've had to what you've heard, and
well,
to parents that
Kristina,
you'd work with?
thank you for the introduction, and I'm so excited to be on this panel discussion. You know, I longtime friends and colleagues with Bill and Oiyan, and now to actually be in this capacity, and also serving as a commissioner on the school board. And first, I'm a mom. I have 2 kids. I have a daughter who is in 11th grade, so you know, college is right around the corner, and we're thinking about it, you know, on a daily basis. And I also have a middle schooler. So all the policies that are coming forward locally to the San Francisco Unified School District, I also have a personal stake in it, but also be given my work over the last 2 decades in looking at social justice movements around civil rights and equity. That's how I arrived at the work. And before, Kristina, I dive into recognizing and empathizing and acknowledging the serious concerns and anxiety that parents have today for their children's future, especially during a pandemic. I also want to give a snapshot about San Francisco Unified and what happens. And, you know, when you have state policies and growing opportunity and achievement gaps that have been persisted for decades, you know, what does that look like in the classroom? What does it look like for a young person's life experience? So I'll maybe just dive for a few minutes there, just to give folks an overview around San Francisco Unified. We have 54,000 students, 10,000 employees. More than half of our students are from low-income socioeconomic backgrounds. More than a third of our students, almost nearly 35-40% percentage, are AAPI. And so when we talk about, you know, how does that look like across the state, clearly that's almost 3 times the amount of API population in SF Unified. At the same time, like I said, we've had a persistent achievement opportunity gap for our students, our Black, Latinx, children in special education, where Asian Americans actually make up, AAPI make up almost a third of our children in special education. So similar to you know, what Bill and others have raised about this myth around who are Asian Americans and what you know, what are the characteristics of students. I just really want to name the struggles that our families and students are facing every day in their educational opportunity. Coupled with this opportunity and educational outcomes for our students, our schools are more segregated today than they have since the 1970s and 80s, due to a school assignment system that leads with choice. And we're reviewing, we're gonna pass a policy by the end of the calendar year to really look at how do we tackle that issue around diversity, around proximity, and a student assignment system, which won't address the long time established equity issues, but it is another step forward. And again, around our students who are English learners and in our multilingual pathways. You have English learners right now that have a gap around in their English language arts, 20 basis difference, both in Spanish and in Chinese students who are English learners. So that gives hopefully somewhat of a context around the atmosphere environment in San Francisco Unified. And that this is also a moment in COVID-19 pandemic distance learning to really think about how are we thinking about 21st century education, how are we thinking about the graduate profile and getting our young people ready, educational excellence for college. I believe every child is positioned to be for educational excellence and for college access. And that journey may take, you know, a different for everyone, but that is the corner. And that with the democracy and the cornerstone, public education is that cornerstone to our democracy. And that's what is at stake today for our country, not just in the state of California and Prop 16. So building upon what Jonathan had raised earlier about how is Prop 16 going to benefit kindergarten through 12th grade education is, one, really looking at how in the state of California, we currently fund through what's called a local control funding formula, where you get increased supplemental funding for students who are English learners, foster youth, low-income students. And again, this continues in California since the passage of Prop 219, that, like Bill said, building upon over 20 years now, right, of income-focused programming and diversity initiatives, but yet we have not seen the gains that we absolutely need, and it is not working. So Prop 16 is going to allow K-12 to be even further targeted in our investments and what we know is needed for interventions, for programs and services for our students most in need. So I just wanted to, again, lift up those benefits of K-12 and earlier around how important it is to have a diverse teacher workforce. I'm seeing it on the ground right now in San Francisco. We do not have a pipeline, an active pipeline of Asian API educators coming to the district, let alone administrators and principals. And I'm really worried about what that looks like for our student body in the coming years. We've tried at our small scale of building up our own pipelines within the district, but this will then really allow a much more systemic change and approach to our educator workforce in the state of California. And also want to name the importance of youth voice and young people being at the table to be able to share their lived life experience for opportunities. And I have the great fortune of working with young people, both in Oakland Public Schools in my early days of running youth development and mentoring programs, to now being in a policy decision role, but also working with young people and their families directly about hearing what those limited opportunities do and what is possible for greater opportunity and equity. So Kristina, I'm going to pause there, and because it's a lot of kind of K-12 kind of focus, but I do want to acknowledge again the concerns, worry of parents. I worry every day, right? How and when are we going to get our students back into the classroom that is safe? How are we going to address, as our youngest learners need to be learning how to read, learning, you know, and the pressures we're putting upon our families, particularly our monolingual immigrant families who around being co-educators in this time of COVID. Mm-hmm. And I would just name what we are seeing in the classroom is so also exciting. The fact that my son now, you know, since 6th grade, my daughter in middle school, when we're looking at middle school redesign, are getting more access to language programs that they haven't had before. We've had access now to computer science. Starting in we have a pre-kindergarten to 12th grade approach for access to computer science. And
that's because of what? And that's because of?
It's through policy, and it is through policy
yeah.
At the school board. But to have it through a race-conscious approach, through Prop 16 will allow additional funding to ensuring what students get those access to those programs over the duration that they're with us in our public, their public school experience.
You also did say that this is the most segregated schools have been. Can you just sort of lay out, if you have numbers on you, or what that is looking like, this segregation? You said it's because of school choice. Can you just sort of?
Yeah, so right now in San Francisco,
give us a clear picture.
There's a lot of racial isolation, and a lot of that is the intersection with housing, right? And how it has become so unaffordable to live in San Francisco. And so you have different pockets, right, of different neighborhoods of who is able to live in which neighborhoods. And so that's where, and because of choice has been one of those effects. Right now, you get to have, for kindergarten, you can put up to, how many schools we have? Over 100, nearly, not 100 schools, but definitely close to that threshold, over 80 elementary schools that you could just put on your application. And that is why we know we need to simplify. We need to be able to be grounded in our values, as well as making sure that parents and families are not traveling across the city for elementary school. So that's part of some of the things that we're tackling at the school district. I, again, wholeheartedly understand the concerns for college and the worries there. At the same time, we can't talk about college admissions and access to higher education if we don't have a solid K-12 experience. And some of the things I want to share with parents is, how have we looked at the investments of higher education over the last 20, 30 years? And that's been hamstrung also to how we're funded here in the state of California for public education. Since I was born, Proposition 13 has really limited the full funding that we know is so desperately needed for K-12 education. So I'll pause there. I know we'll give a chance to dialogue with one another as well, do some Q&A.
Yeah, I just wanted to, Oiyan, you had some observations on programs in Chicago. Do you want to jump in and talk about that real fast?
Yeah, so somebody asked, how do we think Prop 209 led to a 79% drop in the number of contracts awarded to women and minority-owned businesses, and how does affirmative action reverse that in a fair way? And so, my partner actually is an Asian American business owner, very small business. It's him and him alone. He does urban planning. And so to become a minority-owned business, you have to go through a whole certification process. And quite frankly, it's a lot. It's a lot to get through. And so I watched him go through this process of becoming certified. And before certification, his business was rather ignored by public agencies and prime contractors who were interested in partnering with smaller businesses to go after RFPs, requests for proposals for projects. Once he got certified, he got second looks, right? Like, he didn't get contracts because he was Asian, right? They weren't like, oh, hey, look at you, Asian dude who owns the urban planning business. Let's just throw you into this major multi-million-dollar major project about public transit. And, he had to go through the whole process of review to make sure that what he was offering was rigorous and solid and everything. But without the minority business program, he's just his business is just so small and so new that he's just not a known entity. And quite frankly, he's told me, like, he's never going after a California project. He's never submitting for a California project unless there is a minority business enterprise program there, because he's like, it's just not worth the time. They don't know his business. He's not a known entity. He's not going to get a second glance. And that's really what I think minority business owner and women-owned business owner programs do with affirmative action. Again, it's not about just like, oh, hey, it's a certified women-owned business, let's just bring them in. It's really about, like, okay, let's take a second look at your qualifications and what you're bringing to this particular project. And my partner does, projects around public housing and public transit. So you don't want the next BART station built in a shoddy way. So, you want to make sure that whoever's coming to the table for a project is solid. But affirmative action would just allow prime contractors to look at these small businesses a second time. Otherwise, what we have now is that 96%, something like 96%, I haven't looked at the most latest stats, but something like 96% of public contracting dollars go to white male-owned businesses. And that's, public contracts come from our tax base. We all pay into it, and yet it's just going into uplifting the wealth of people who have had wealth for centuries.
Okay, I'm going to start, thank you for that. I want to start transitioning some of these questions that we've gotten, and one sort of leads off the last answer you offered, Oiyan, and other folks on the panel can jump in. How do we keep accountable public entities that will be able to use affirmative action if Prop 16 passes? How do we make sure we don't misuse affirmative action? And I think maybe that question needs some framing. Can affirmative action be misused? Is that a myth? Does anyone want to address that?
Let me jump in. I think anything can
Okay.
be misused. I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, well, could the worst case scenario happen? And yeah, I mean, there could be any misuse in any scenario. There's misuse now without affirmative action. So it's not like passing Prop 16 will create a whole nother one. It's, these democracy and your government is incumbent upon your participation. So if you're not electing people who are going to be the watchdogs over how government works, then obviously it's going to come off the rails. And we've seen that in little cities that have no oversight. We've seen that in the federal government where oversight is too impossible because of the size of the bureaucracy. And a lot of where we are today politically is because of the lack of participation of the public in the government system. And having been a staffer for a long time, people are isolated away from what government does. And in a lot of ways, they don't want to know what government does. They just want to go on with their lives and do their things. But you have to be involved. You have to register to vote. You have to vote, and you have to be educated about the decisions that your representatives makes in order to make sure that abuse doesn't occur. And that happens in any situation, not just affirmative action or whatever. But you have to be a participant in the process.
Yeah, I agree. As I'm on neighborhood council, which I know I've laid out to the public as a very sexy public office. It's actually the lowest power public office, but I am seeing how we have a high turnover because it's an unpaid position, and we used to have a lot of folks who actually worked. We had one guy who used to work for Airbnb and was on the housing committee. I don't know how that happened. But like as folks who work in housing development have left, and people who don't work in housing development, I've seen the vote shift very quickly to be more in support of renters and more in support of affordable housing. And that's you have to kind of keep an eye and be active. You don't just leave it and go. So I think with all things, as I'm going to paraphrase what Bill is saying, there is a certain vigilance that we must have as voters, as citizens, to keep an eye on things and make sure that they are not being abused. All right, I'm going to bring in another questions. Okay, Oiyan, why don't you answer? We're getting a lot of questions here about admissions, and some of these questions are asking, like one person has asked if currently many UCs have over 35% APIs, would this hurt API students? There's another one, would a class-based system work better and be less polarizing than a race-based one to address diversity issues? And it also brings up the Princeton study that has found that Asian students had to score an average 540 points higher than Black students on their SATs in order to get to the top school. Isn't this just unfair? Thank you for this panel. You're welcome. Oiyan, can you address some of these questions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly, as much as we try to broaden the focus of affirmative action and recognizing that it's not just about selective admissions, this is something at the heart of our community that really gets us riled up. So happy to answer these questions. So in response to Asian parents who are concerned about Prop 16 hurting their kids in college admissions, there's no evidence that that's actually, that affirmative action hurts Asian kids in college admissions. In fact, a colleague of mine, Mike Wawin, just published, I just posted it in the chat box for everyone, a really outstanding study that shows, that really explores some of these claims empirically. And it's not hurting. In fact, it's helping. So for instance, in the Harvard case, we see when you're looking at race conscious year to year for each student cohort, the admission rates fluctuate year to year. If there was a cap in the practice of affirmative action in these ways, you would see a stagnant percentage of admission rates for Asian students, but you just don't. You see it going up and you see it going down. In fact, this fall's entering freshman class at Harvard is 25% Asian. You know, if they really wanted to hurt Asian students through affirmative action, they're doing a really bad job of it. To be really honest, I love this question. I'm the mother of 2 college students. Daughter just went through college app. Curious your opinion. Let the process work, and the right college will pick you. You know, something else that I'm finding in my current study, in my confidential interviews with college admissions officers, is that several of them were really frustrated when Asian American applicants didn't talk about or check off the box of being Asian American, because they could tell that these students were holding themselves back and stifling themselves, and so then their files looked really wonky and just off. And these admissions officers felt really sad because they were like, this was a student that I felt like I really liked. I think they were Asian because their name, but because they didn't talk about it or what that meant to them to be Asian or check off a box to kind of suggest who they were hindered in the committee room to advocate for Asian American students that didn't come forward with their full stories. And so, yeah, that article link that I posted in the chat box also talks about how, in some ways, you know, college admissions process is sort of like a matchmaking process, like a marriage matchmaking process. Every institution is really admitting students based on what their interests are. And first and foremost, they want academically strong students. They are not admitting students who are academic slackers. You know, they are looking for the strongest possible students first and foremost. That's their major cut. But then at the end of the day, at the most highly selective places, they still have an overabundance of very talented students. And so I think the myth is then they just go cutting by race, and it's not true. So getting to the whole class-based piece, there's multiple research studies by a Stanford economist named Reardon, forget his last name, but he has multiple studies that show that actually class-based systems benefit white students much more than anyone else. And when you take into account race-conscious systems, and there is no such thing as class-based or race-based systems because no one's getting admitted based on their race. No one's getting admitted based on their class. And race-conscious processes allow for a complicated look at every applicant as individuals, and it actually produces a much richer class and race diverse class of highly talented students. So there's a major myth that, you know, outside of Asian and white kids, that somehow everyone else is academically crappy. The Princeton study included, you know, okay, so this Princeton study, I'm gonna get methodologically wonky a little bit really quickly. Espen Shade is the name of the researcher in that, and he has been interviewed multiple times since producing that study and saying, like, everyone is misinterpreting his study. He's not saying that, you know, he was like, there's major limitations to his project. Number one, he couldn't take into account all the factors that get considered in race-conscious holistic admissions. Because there's dozens and dozens and dozens of factors, and I'm finding that to be true in my own study right now, is that there are at some places hundreds of factors that could get considered. Most of these factors, including accounting for things like the SAT, benefit white students, and they don't benefit students of color, including Asian American students. And so because Espen Shade was only able to account for, I believe, about 7 or 8 factors, his study is incomplete. Secondly, his data came from the 1990s, prior to the robust practice of holistic review that I presented on. And so he's using data that is out of date. Thirdly, and finally, about that study, everyone forgets to notice that the data in that study actually found that in the race-conscious affirmative action practices in the 1990s, it was actually low-income Asians that benefited quite a bit from affirmative action. So if you're concerned about class diversity and racial diversity, then you should support this complex approach to race-conscious holistic admissions. Did I get all of the admissions related stuff? Oh, and if currently API is over 35% and many UCs, would affirmative action hurt API students? No. It's my very simple answer to that. And I know, Jenny, you said you wanted to chime in, so I'm just gonna let you do that.
I just want to bring back again to this Generation Z and young people, right? And what kind of society and how are they living with purpose? I just want to really bring that back because I think, you know, I don't think any of us are right now within the Gen Z age range here, but, you know, just to kind of bring back again, this focus on college admissions. College admission does not equal, quote, well-being and success for a human being. And this is where I'm hearing from young people right now, right? Around the many stressors, even before COVID hit, the anxiety. And I just want to lift up the, you know, again, the intersections of health, wellness, purpose, and really where young people want to see themselves contributing. That we had after the George Floyd murder that we had over 20,000 people in the streets of San Francisco, and that was organized by students. And now we have Vote 16 on the local ballot that's coming that will allow young people to vote in local elections. And so I just really want to acknowledge and recognize young people are leading this way of how they're, again, how they want to see the society and this country moving forward. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, the word I really feel like I'm hearing is holistic, which I know from the health world, right? That it's not just like you take a bunch of pills and you get better. It's like, no, you got to improve your diet. You got to you have to think good thoughts and shift all factors. And I definitely feel like, yeah, it maybe, we are so hyper focused on it, like test scores and grades, and there's so many things that make a student a promising student. And an interesting human being. Let me jump to this question, which is a lot of can we just get through some of the myth busting? Like some folks are asking for just simple talking points that what do people usually come up at you with, and what's the quick succinct way? Because we spent an hour going into great detail. People still don't know how to do it. So can we just name off some myths and some responses?
Actually, can I jump in on that one?
Sure, Bill.
I think a lot of times we think that political discourse is one fact against the other. Is this kind of Lincoln Douglas debate. Ultimately, it comes down to a conversation about values, and I think that particularly for the yes on 16 side, we have to like Jenny said, really be cognizant that the people on the other side aren't all, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, are not bad people. They're just concerned about the future of their children, their family. This is what they've been taught. I mean, my parents were like that as well, and it's not their fault. That's just where they're at. But they have to have the conversation. I think that one of the most telling examples about how this worked was back when there was this ballot proposition about gay marriage and marriage equality. And a lot of people thought that Asians weren't in support of marriage equality when they actually were. But the interesting thing about that was that when you approach them from the perspective of their family members who are gay or lesbian, that's where the conversation started. So, there's not always a good soundbite for something as complex as affirmative action in Prop 16. And that's why, our conversations with people who disagree or are undecided about it have to be conversations. It's not just, this is right and that's wrong. It's much more nuanced than that.
Does anyone else have?
Also jump on.
Yeah,
on that real quick.
Jonathan.
So I totally agree with Bill. We definitely need to meet folks where they're at and to have down-to-earth conversations about our values, but we also have to have, an understanding of the data and an understanding of the history. A lot of us come from backgrounds where our parents immigrated from China or East Asia or Southeast Asia or South Asia. And we have to also take into account the immigration laws and other circumstances have really allowed our AAPI community to have, increased access to opportunity more so than other groups and the other historical and social conditions that have really accommodated that. And so once we talk about, these historical factors that have affected our opportunities and in some ways obstructed opportunity for other groups, we can also talk about ways that we can address that inequality, address that those obstacles, and find ways like affirmative action to uplift other communities and members of our own community, so that all of us can succeed and all of us can have access to schools like UCLA and UC Berkeley.
Anyone else, or I could jump to another question? Okay, there's this question from Susan. Will the AAPI community be looked at in a disaggregated manner? Will there be consideration for people who are differently abled, and will there be affirmative, I'm guessing affirmative action for those who identify as LGBTQ? So I guess this is more a question of how affirmative action will work. Does anyone have questions?
So that's actually how I'm finding it to work in my research about selective admissions and race-conscious admissions. I mean, race-conscious is totally a misnomer, because quite frankly, what I'm finding is that there's a very intersectional analysis of every individual student. And so then, there's no such thing as race-based admissions or gender-based admissions. It's really looking at like Kristina Wong, her profile, her data set that we have about her, school performances and her life circumstances to this point, what does this tell us about her? And what do we think about her as a whole package, right? Rather than just like, she checked off Asian, next. Like, it doesn't work like that at all. In fact, it's just like looking at like, okay, what is, and I think most importantly, what I understand as a former UC admissions reader in the non-race conscious process post 209 is that, you know, basically we were only able to look at students up to a certain point. We couldn't really fully understand who they were unless they told us about, you know, their whole story. And I want to just highlight like this moment of anti-Asian racism with COVID and Trump continually calling it the Kung flu and the Chinese virus. I know when I was a young person, I was racially harassed relentlessly in high school. From the time I was in kindergarten all the way through the time I graduated from high school. It made doing school really hard. Mentally, emotionally, physically, it was very hard to get through school. And so that's a racialized story. I was also a translator for my immigrant family. That's a racialized story. With Prop 209, we can't tell these stories, right? So when you have these students who are relentlessly bullied because Trump keeps calling it the Kung flu right now, and maybe someone's suffering and they're like, that semester my grades dropped. You know, you could tell that story, but without race conscious admissions or without affirmative action, that story doesn't come fully valued, isn't fully respected. And I think that's an important aspect that we need to think about. And, you know, add to it maybe someone's sexual orientation or gender diversity and, you know, in their class backgrounds, so on and so forth. Like, every person is an individual, and everyone's story is super complex. And so my takeaway, you know, piece is that this is about human dignity. This is about our unique stories. And Prop 16 allows our public institutions and leaders to actually see us for us as human beings, as actual individuals with complex experiences and stories to bring to the table.
Does anyone have anything to add to that point? We have another, how does this work from Hannah? Hannah 1 has a question, is how would Prop 16 prevent an overrepresentation of white women who have been shown to receive the greatest benefit from affirmative action? How is this proposition intersectional? So I was not familiar that more white women were benefiting from this, so please confirm that that's true, and if anyone can speak to it being intersectional.
As a researcher, I'll say that right now in the social sciences, there's a lot of debate over this. No one can really track down that finding. You know, I think this is one of those things that gets shared multiple times like a game of telephone. And so we're not sure. Yeah, I think there's some research now that is like trying to confirm that, but it's, yeah.
So that might not even be the case as we're getting. What other, are you looking at the questions? Any other questions we want to bring? Folks, final words. Let's do a final word. And then we'll wrap it and let folks know how they can ask additional questions if they have them for you, if you're willing to answer it after this. Bill, any final words? Jonathan, any final words?
You know, I guess I'll begin real quick. So I'm kind of a Gen Z-er millennial. I was kind of born in the borderline of those days. So I know that at least for my generation, we're really aware of the racial injustices that are happening right now. And a lot of us are really attuned to social media. A lot of us are on TikTok. A lot of us are on Instagram. And a lot of us lean away from Facebook and Twitter. But when we talk with one another, and increasingly now with us having to social distance, a lot of it is virtual. And a lot of it, us and our conversations are narrowed by what we can talk about online. So when I see our conversations about racial justice happening, a lot of it is visual and a lot of it is informed by data and statistics and these quick blurbs. And so I can share with you some of the blurbs that have worked amongst my peers. And a lot of that has been that, you know, Prop 16 is literally endorsed by every major civil rights group. It's endorsed by the founders of Black Lives Matter. It's endorsed by the NAACP, MALDF, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, thousands of students, all UC regents, the CSU Board of Trustees, even random celebrities like John Legend and more that are in the pipeline. There's this huge community that is aware of racial injustice, but is, or is hesitant to really partake other than, posting a Black picture on Instagram. We're unsure of really what to do other than turn out in the streets because we don't have that power. But I want to say that, with members of my community, we actually can have that power by voting and by spreading awareness of, these initiatives like Prop 16 that will help bring about this kind of more just and equitable world. On that note, I know that, generational difficulties, impact a lot of us. A lot of us live with parents and grandparents who don't understand, the same language. And it's important, again, as Bill had mentioned, to really talk to them heart to heart about the perspectives and values that we have, but also the values that we share. And that includes, a just and equitable society for all of us to live in, not just a few.
I'll also chime in. I think, my last word is, I've been involved in politics for a long time, and there's always a struggle to be at the seat at the table of power. And I think this is a turning point for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community too. We all know this is a tough vote for all of us because we have relatives and friends who strongly and genuinely believe that affirmative action may affect their future. But it is the right side of history. It is a decision that we have an opportunity to make and take a courageous stand on that is obviously difficult and difficult to talk about. But if we don't take up this at this time and in this manner that is the right direction for our history and where we stand as part of this society, we will never be respected in the political or American society if we're always only perceived as self-interested in our personal future and our personal ability to rise at the expense of other people. So I'm not using reason, I'm not using stats about how this could benefit Asian Americans. I just think that we have to take a little bit of us if that's what it means in order to do what's right at this point in time.
Thank you. Jenny or Oiyan?
I just want to acknowledge again Bill and Jonathan's comments earlier that it is such a critical moment right now for our country, and we are fighting. We are fighting for our democracy, and Prop 16 goes to the heart of our protecting and advancing progress and our democracy. And I just think it's so critical to be able to have those intergenerational conversations. Clearly, how can we build up in language resources, right, for our immigrant communities so that we can have dialogue and so we can learn about history and all the work that I've done over the years in working with monolingual immigrant parents. It was a lot about political education around U.S. history, and I think that's part of on us to do that work within our own communities moving forward.
Oiyan, last words?
I'm not in California. I'm not a California voter. But I'm just really hopeful that California will really take the lead and do what's right and be on the right side of history. And hopefully this panel has, and thank you all for coordinating this OCA. California, you have an opportunity to really do what's right and to recognize that if we recognize that racism is a problem and that various forms of oppression are problems, that we don't like them, like we need the public tools and policy tools to dismantle them. And so, I really, it's no question that people like Donald Trump are against Prop 16, right? Like whose side are you on, right? And so I think ultimately at the end of the day, like Bill mentioned, it's really a moral question. So that's just please vote.
Yes, please vote in general. I'm assuming you're all voting because you've spent Saturday with us. And what I'm hearing is, how, like, if if you've been bullied as an Asian person in school, and like, and you have an issue now with the anti-Asian bullying, wouldn't you be in line for other racial justice measures and moves to bring equality to all, right? Like, we're not just going to move ahead of everyone else and leave them behind. So that's definitely something I heard today. I want to thank you all so much. There's still some questions coming in, and hopefully the panelists can just answer them directly in the chat. Maybe we can hang out for a few minutes just to make sure those are answered. But I want to thank OCA for hosting this very informative panel, for asking me to be the distinguished moderator. I hope I was distinguished for you all. I'm wearing house slippers, but very distinguished. If you want to find out more about OCA National and chapters, you can go to ocanational.org. And thank you so much. I guess we can just hang out a little just to answer any more questions inside the chat, but I'll leave it to George and OCA National to officially shut us down and leave us to our Saturday.
That's right. Thank you, Kristina. Thank you, panelists, for an outstanding discussion. It touched the heart and the mind, and I hope it gave people some information that will help them make decisions and to help them talk to their families and friends. And that's it for us today. Thank you all. For those who could not tune in at this time, or if you want to share this information with others, this webinar is going to be posted on the OCA National's YouTube channel. So look for OCA Asian Pacific American Advocates YouTube channel, and then find out more on ocanational.org as well. Thank you all.